interesting point that Tasha just talked about as well, which is it could be that it's not one society, it's actually a set of societies within a certain discipline who there's potential to have collaboration, and there may be ways that Wiley can assist with that, given the sort of the large stable of societies that we work with, and the fact that we can be the glue in certain ways, that we can use the network that we already have to help facilitate some of that work. And I'd say that's true within discipline, potentially across sub-disciplines, but of course also across regions. And there's already good working relationships between many societies, but especially as Asia Pacific starts to really come on stream more dramatically in the next few years, I think publishers like Wiley, not just us, but others will certainly have roles they can play to help support. Does that kind of answer it? Looks like as a follow-on.
Well, yeah, it's, I suppose my question is about how would Wiley work with a collection of societies who are publishing on different platforms, so not all with Wiley?
That's something we could potentially look at, and we can have this conversation afterwards. Obviously, we did acquire Atipon fairly recently, and that's provided a very strong publisher platform for us to work with, and we're leveraging that platform in different ways right now. But that shouldn't necessarily rule out other types of model as well. And I think that we're very much, as I said before, we need to evolve and innovate and be very open-minded about how we approach the ways we can support societies going forward. And that sounds a bit trite, but I do think that some cases, no, this is the model we have, and we're being very, very rigid about that. I don't think that's our mindset.
There's a question. You sure? Did anyone else want to say anything about that?
I'm just going to add a slightly shameless plug, but with my AccuComms hat on, then that collaborative sales operation is exactly what we had in mind when we invented the AggregAgent. So that's the ability for multiple organizations on multiple different platforms to collaboratively sell their content to libraries. So just one aspect of that.
I was thinking more along the lines of what societies can do for ourselves. We are a collection of incredibly intelligent and driven people. We do not need to rely on third parties quite so much as we maybe do. But we also need to be very pragmatic about where we start. So there's lots of nice concepts around making societies integrate with each other and collaborate very broadly. But actually, maybe we can pick small projects to begin with. So as a really good example, we've got World Microbiome Day on the 27th, which I think is today. I'm losing track of dates. Tomorrow. And the Microbiology Society publishing arm and the British Society of Immunology publishing arm have collaborated on a collection of content for World Microbiome Day. It's really small as a starting point, but it is collaboration beyond the bounds of a single society or even a single discipline. That came out of a simple conversation over lunch one day. You know, we can start small and grow from there.
I would just reinforce what you're saying as well, Tasha. We had, there's a guy, the Royal Statistical Society, Hetan Shah, who's the exec director there, and he spoke at an event a few months ago. And it was all about that innovative thinking that society leaders can really bring to bear. I mean, you own this in the room. And sure, societies like Wiley, large and small, can help support in whatever ways we can be of value to you. But ultimately, that degree of diversification, of looking at your portfolio and what's really most important to your members is ultimately it's going to drive your thinking.
Got a question at the front here.
I thought you might be disappointed if you didn't get a question from the other Simon in the room, Simon Ross from Manchester University Press. I actually think science societies are particularly well placed to capitalise on the changes in the market. So Simon Peel said that the researcher is now their new North Star, and that's presumably because they are seen as the future source of income. Now, who has relationships, better relationships with researchers than societies? They have a direct relationship, so they really are well placed to make most of the opportunity in the the potential negative changes seen by some people in the market. So I think there is a real opportunity for societies to work on that. Conversely, I actually think that societies can get an awful lot from publishers. And one of the things that they can get from publishers, choosing the right publishing partner, that is that they can often use the publisher as an agent of change. A change that they cannot drive themselves internally, and they can use the publisher to help them drive that change and push things forward. And so I wouldn't be too defensive about looking at a publishing partner as an option, because I think there are lots of things that can be gained from that. It's not just about access to a bigger market and a stronger sales force. There are other things you can do, and like Simon Beale had said there, the things like working on the other activities of the society. It's unlikely that they can do much with outreach, but they can certainly promote the society to a wider audience, but certainly along other services, operational, background stuff, they can certainly do that. I did have one technical point about your model, Tasha.
Please.
Does your average APC incorporate those articles where there are fee waivers?
It can do. That's
Right.
why it's got the average realised APC as a percentage. So if you know that you usually give on average a 10% discount,
Yeah.
then you factor that in at
Okay,
that point.
good, thank you.
Does anyone else have a comment or question? Yeah, in the middle.
Sorry. A comment, really sort of trying to draw threads within each of the presentations. So if you're saying that data sharing, raw data sharing, is really going to become a new byword for research networking, well, there are nods of approval there, and research networking and through preprints is going to be a new and important mechanism. Would you like to comment on the fact that when will publishers actually start to perhaps compete with societies in the world of conferences, where the whole vision of creating conferences is that networking of raw data before publishing? And are we likely to see perhaps societies pushing back against publishing, recognizing that conferences is another important income stream associated with societies? And who better actually to organise conferences than the people who've got the members?
I believe that Nature are already trying to do that. We've had a number of our members say that they would rather come to our conference than the Nature conference, which is extremely comforting and extremely helpful. But this is already starting to happen, and societies are going to need to watch their backs and be very clever about how they make sure that their conferences are still the ones to go to.
I could sort of, it's a very interesting question. Our strategic process is constantly changing, and so therefore I won't commit to anything and never say never. But it's certainly not something that we're thinking about at this point in time. In terms of getting involved in the conferences themselves and sort of trying to bypass societies. I think it's because they're so important to us as partners. I came years and years and years ago from Elsevier, and of course they have that sort of that sort of conference component traditionally as well with Read Expos, and many publishers have experimented and dabbled with that. I'm a firm believer in saying know what you're good at and know what your sweet spot is and where you've got a core competency, and it may well be there are other areas that you need to diversify into, but most of the time, not always, not unless you make a very good slick acquisition, I find it's best to partner with other players, and I'm thinking of societies in this case, to work to really improve that conference offering. That's just my view.
I guess, I mean, the fundamental piece here is, as was commented earlier, is where the relationships lie, and the societies have the relationships with the individuals. So I'd look at conferences or indeed any other activity as another service element. So it's all really about, so publishers could it's going to be harder for a publisher to own a conference than it is to collaborate with a society to serve a conference, I would say, going forward. So, but, it's for the societies to relinquish control rather than for somebody to aggressively take it, I think.
And even though I'm the chair and probably am not meant to have an opinion, I do. And I think that's one of the things that societies need to be doing right now, is looking at what they do and asserting what their space is. And I think precisely that conference space is one to own. I mean, you own it already, but, be assertive about that space being an area of expertise and part of the core offering of what you bring. I think it's quite straightforward, but I think there's a time for the strategic review of what it is you're doing and making the most of the things that you're already doing well and not letting that dissolve away. I'll shut up now. Has anyone else got something to say? Yes, over there.
Yes, I'm Steve Williams from Elsewhere. I had a quick question about open access discounts for members, mainly for Tasha. Is that something you see a big demand for and you expect more in the future?
So it's been interesting. There has been some demand in the past for open access discounts for members, and we do have them as standard. We're actually in the process of assessing our article processing charges, our approach to discounting and so on. And certainly in the last year or so, the demand has been increasing and we're more than happy to meet it. So we find it an excellent tool to promote our journals. I hope that answers the question.
Anyone else? Tasha, have you got anything you want to add? Or Simon, actually, let's just go for it.
I'm only going to say that I believe this break will have coffee in it for those who are feeling withdrawal symptoms.
It's not yet though, Simon, you can't run away just yet. We have?
I'd say one last thing, and that's that we've touched on open access, and Steve, your last sort of question there, and I talked a bit about it. We've all touched on it. I think that this next 2 or 3 years in this industry, and I'm talking about the publishing industry, the learned sort of academic publishing industry, is going to be pretty tumultuous. And we always talk about, the next few years are going to be the most exciting years that we're going to live through. And we look back and think, actually, no, it didn't happen yet. But I think it's on the cusp of happening. And I think there will be a great deal of flux in our communities over the coming few years.
Specifically around open access?
Absolutely, specifically around open access, yeah. And again, I think that the more there's very good, strong communication between commerce and academics and societies and members and researchers, the better shape we're going to be in. So I guess all I'd say is that that level of collaboration and communication across various parts of what I call the industry, I think is going to be paramount in the next few years.
I take your point, and absolutely open access is a very big factor, and it's something we need to bear in mind at all times. But we also need to remember that while it's very much at the forefront of thinking in the UK, Europe, US, a lot of our market isn't actually that bothered. You know, we operate a lot in China, Korea, South America, and there isn't the demand yet. I'm sure it will come, but there isn't the demand and there isn't the funding at this point for open access in those markets. So we have a very interesting time ahead of us.
I'll just throw in, I mean, I think China is the key. And at the moment, it's very hard to see what's in the best interests of China as to whether open access is the answer or the status quo. At the moment, open access on the one hand gives probably increased exposure to Chinese scientists more quickly. But on the other hand, China generally gets a bloody good deal on subscription and pays disproportionately small amounts. So if I were a Chinese government looking at this from a purely financial point of view, I would say the status quo is pretty darn good. But if I took a different view and thought, what's going to be best for the individuals and for the science in China, do I get a better end result by pushing OA, then OA is what will happen. But I do tend to think it hinges on China more than it hinges on anything else.
Any last thoughts before we go for our coffee? Okay, thank you very much to our panellists and thank you for listening.